think it's going to be Wednesdays. Barbecue, pizza. I don't know what else they've got. We have in front of the fancy buildings over here, you know, where they have the jiggy with the picnic.
Oh, yeah.
So on Wednesdays, I think from 11 to 2 or so. So you can drive by there on the way out and see if you can find something for lunch. I think it's going to be Wednesdays. I'm not sure if it's all summer or they're just going to try it 3 or 4 weeks and see how it goes. Every Wednesday for at least 3 or 4 more times. So I'm excited. Raleigh, I don't know if you've ever been to the food truck rodeo in Raleigh, but they've got like 30 different food trucks.
They do Food Truck Friday in Concord and in South End.
Yeah. All right. All right, let's go over a little bit about head injury. That's one of the things that I found that working with a lot of these clients is that traumatic brain injury, or you will see it referred to now in the literature as TBI, is really a rewarding part of nursing, because a lot of times you would see these folks come in severely injured and then progress. And then sometimes you would think, you know, there is no way that this person is ever going to be able to do something, and then 6 months later they walk back up on the floor and you ask if you remember them, and you almost have to sit down because of the amazing transformation that they make. But anytime, anywhere, anyone, brain injuries do not discriminate. Brain Injury Association is a very good organization to refer patients and families to. It's one of those things that you will see that, you know, what you think is the most minor bump on the head can cause major problems in their life. Most common cause are motor vehicle crashes. Okay, you will see now that they refer to as automobile accidents as MVCs, not MVAs. The reason being is that accident implies that it could not have been prevented. And a lot of times what you will see is that with an MVC, it could have been prevented. Falls. Who do you think is most likely to develop head injury because of falls?
Elderly.
The old and the young, just like everything else, the two on the spectrum. Okay? Acts of violence. We're seeing a lot of gunshot wounds to the head. We're seeing a lot of baseball bats. Somebody going naked on somebody. I saw a poor little man that got robbed of his disability check with a cement block to his head. Okay? So what you're going to see is all sorts of acts of violence. The guy with the butcher knife. It was funny when I was in Durham. Durham is it's a largest town, but it's the smallest large town I've ever seen. Because they reported every fight, every gunshot, every accident in the paper. And I could read the paper in the morning and know what my assignment was going to be. You know, when I was here. But when I moved to Charlotte, I thought, well, where are all of the, you know, accidents? They have so many they don't even report them anymore. And you don't make the paper unless you're dead. So I'm not going to see you there. Sports-related injuries is increasing phenomenally. terminally. And I think that we've all seen in the media about CTE, concussive traumatic encephalopathy. You see it with a lot of press right now about the NFL and football. But I'm going to tell you guys, the people you need to watch for CTE are your kids that play soccer. Because we're seeing a tremendous increase in concussions with these kids that play soccer that are hitting the ball. And I'm going to tell you, girls have had a 50% increase in the amount of concussions over boys in soccer. We are also starting to see survivors of wartime blast injuries, our veterans that are coming back with traumatic brain injury. Okay? There are over 1 million people every year that suffer some type of head injury. But that doesn't mean that every one of them is totally disabled. There are varying levels of survivorship and recovery. Now, when you're talking about pathophysiology of head injury, you're talking about two things: direct injury or indirect injury. Now, I know that you've probably heard of coup and contre-coup injuries, C-O-U-P, and C-R-A-N-T-R-A, C-O-U-P. Coup injuries are basically a direct hit. If I take an object and slam it down on someone's head, the area underneath that impact is where your direct injury is. But think about that brain. It sits in that CSF and it flows. And it moves. It's not rigid in there. So if I punch this side, what's it going to do on the other side? Slam against there. That's called a contre-coup injury, or an indirect injury. So if I am trying to figure out what kind of problems my patient's going to have, I'm going to look for things related to that direct injury. And I'm going to be looking for things related to that contre-coup or that indirect injury. Now, with your indirect injuries, sometimes it can be rotational. For example, a boxer, gets hit with a right cross. And what happens is their head turns around. That brain also rotates inside that skull cavity. Okay? So you can have rotational injury as well. Now, what's so bad about that? Well, fibers get pulled and stretched. And the brain doesn't like stretching. Primary brain injury, open. Usually an open head injury means there is a defect in the scalp and the skull. That there is open connection between that brain and the outside world. Closed head injury means that there's just damage. It can be to the skull, to the brain, but there's no opening to the rest of the world. The scalp is intact. The majority of your head injuries are going to be closed head injuries. The open ones are the ones that are really boring and make good pictures. But majority of them are going to be closed. And if you look at this patient, you can't see an obvious reason for their injury. They may have a little bit of a goose egg on their head, but they don't look very damaged, so to speak. Now, other things that can happen are secondary brain injury. Secondary brain injury is typically caused by anoxia or hypoxia or increased intracranial pressure. Something that causes that anoxic injury may be swelling of that brain that elevates ICP, that decreases cerebral blood flow. So one of the things we want to do as nurses is to make sure that we prevent as much of the secondary brain injury as possible by controlling that ICP, by monitoring for it, and informing the physician if that patient's having problems. Now, when you look at severity of traumatic brain injury, they typically talk about mild, GCS or Glasgow Coma Scale of 13 to 15. Remember, 15 is the highest that you can get. These people will have loss of consciousness up to 15 minutes. It's one of the things that you always ask bystanders, did they lose consciousness? If they didn't, then that's not a big deal. But if they lost consciousness enough that they were out for a few minutes, then that meant that there was damage to that brain. Mild loss of consciousness within 15 minutes, and then seemingly they seem okay. But I will tell you, I have seen a lot of problems with patients with mild traumatic brain injury. Typically, these people are not even admitted to the hospital. They're sent home with instructions of wake them up every 2 hours and make sure that they wake up. It's where the rumor got started where you don't let them fall asleep. No, you let them fall asleep because I'm going to be irritated as hell if you don't let me sleep. And you're going to think it's a change in my level of consciousness. But no, you just wake them up. If they wake up easily, then you're good to go. But if they don't, then you call the 911. Yes?
When I was in high school, I got hit in the face. I played soccer. I had a bunch of concussions. So I took it directly to the nose, and I had a really bad concussion when I broke my nose, like cracked. But I had to be on 2-hour checks, and I had to wear like a collar and everything. I had whiplash and then a pretty bad concussion from a soccer concussion. But it's no joke.
No, it's not. And I will tell you, concussion is one of those things. I had a friend at Duke. You had 2 options for parking. And those of us that were lazy paid back then it was $20 a month to park in the parking deck across the street. So you walked across and went into the hospital. If you didn't pay the $20 a month, it was a free lot, but you had to take a bus to get to the hospital because it was a mile away from the hospital. Well, she was crossing the street and a car hit her. Knocked her down. She bumped her head. She's a neuro nurse. So immediately they call 911, take her to the ER, the doc see her. The only reason they admitted her to the hospital was because she was one of ours. Otherwise she would have gone home. But she was in this category, that mild, GCS of 13 to 15, the loss of consciousness for up to 15 minutes. She came back to work, did fine until she went back to school for a BSN. And what happened is that she failed her first 3 tests because she could not transfer from her test paper to that Scantron sheet. If you looked at her paper, all of the answers were correct. If you looked at the Scantron, she didn't know anything. She had to work with a neuropsychologist in order to regain some of those skills. Now, you can't use that as an excuse. But that's when it showed up. With that problem, with her being able to transfer from one to the other. We got her testing accommodations and she did fine. But it was one of those very frustrating things. She was able to carry out her day-to-day living. She was able, because back then we used paper charts, honey. And there wasn't no computers. It was, everything was handwritten. But with the help of the neuropsychologist, she got over it. But that is one of the things that you can see with devastating brain injury. I will try to remember tomorrow to bring this thing from Reader's Digest. There is a book with this physician that suffers the same type of brain injury. It's called Over My Head. And it talks about her first day that she goes for a rehab session. She lives in New York and has to take a bus, and it's basically, to get ready for this session, it takes her 3.5 hours to take a shower and get dressed and get her session. I'll read it to you because it's really amazing what some of these folks go through. Moderate head injury, GCS of 9 to 12. They can have loss of consciousness up to 6 hours. Severe, remember 3 to 8. What do these people look like when they come?
Comatose.
They're in comatose. They have loss of consciousness over 6 hours, and typically these are the people that you have to protect their airway by intubating them, okay, and making sure that airway is protected. You may have to mechanically support them. Now, these are just some types of fractures. I thought they were sort of cool. Depressed skull fracture. You can see it just presses in, okay? With adults, after the sutures close, you will see breaks, but it's sort of cool, not for the kid, but on babies. They have those softer, pliable bones. With skull fractures with kids, they're called like ping pong ball fractures. Because, you know, if you take a ping pong ball and push it in, it stays in, but it doesn't break. Baby skulls do the same thing. They will push in, but they don't break. Now, think about this. I've got bony fragments here. What has that done to that brain underneath? Yeah, lacerated, and you may have bleeding under there. Open fracture, just you can see the skin is done. Comminuted fracture. Comminuted fractures just mean it's splintered all to get out. So you have lots of little bone shards that go into the brain. Now this guy, 3.5-inch nail into his brain and survives. What was so cool about this, I got this one out of the newspaper. This was in Australia. He walked around for 2 months like this and didn't know it.
How do you not know that?
Don't know, but he kept having headaches, and he came into the hospital for the doctor to check out for his headache, and they did a CT, and the doctor almost passed out. Saw this nail in his head. So we had to have surgery to remove it. Headaches went away. He had no clue how it happened. No clue. But I'm going to tell you, those nail guns can be vicious because they basically are concussive blast. When they first came out, we used to have a lot of construction workers with impalement injuries because they were in nail gun fights.
Oh
my God! They thought that that was cool. It's just, hey, y'all watch this.
Oh my.
Hold my beer. Hold my beer. Those are the 3 words. That the next word is hello. My name is Renee. I'm going to be your nurse today. Basilar skull fracture. Signs and symptoms. Like I said, the base of the skull. Okay, there's a fracture there. Typically, you see 2 distinct signs, and it's called raccoon eyes. Basically, you just look like a raccoon because both of the eyes blacken. Okay? The other sign is called battle sign. Not that you've been in a battle. It was Dr. Battle that described it. But basically, this is ecchymosis or bruising of the mastoid bone. Okay? The other thing you will see is, this guy's got this drainage here. That looks a little bloody, but I would probably say that this guy probably has a CSF leak from that basilar skull fracture. Yes. Remember, you test it for glucose. Now, this is one important thing this is a KDOD for the word go. KDOD, KDOD, KDOD. If people have a head injury, do not put anything up their nose until basilar skull fractures have been ruled out. The reason why is this. This is an NG tube in someone's brain. Wow. See where it goes? Because the base of the skull here was fractured, and it traveled way up there and all the way around. And no, you're not going to hear no vowel sounds coming through this. Nothing up the nose. No nasal suctioning, no tubes. They will even orally intubate patients that have head injury because we don't want to take the risk. Yeah, you'll get brain if you suction.
They won't even order them.
Alright. Closed head injuries. They're basically 4 types. Contusion, concussion, diffuse axon injury, or lacerations. Contusion basically just means bruise. The brain bruises like everything else. It has a blood supply, you damage those vessels, and you get a bruise. Concussion basically just means like you rattled somebody's cage. Okay? The brain itself has shaken within that cranial vault. That's why it's so dangerous to shake babies. For shaken baby syndrome, what happens is they develop concussion and they will eventually get bleeding and they die from increased intracranial pressure. Diffuse axonal injury. Think of the brain as a slinky, okay? And if I've got neurons and axons and I stretch that slinky out, does it always go back the exact way it was supposed to? No. That's what VAI is. It's stretching of those neurons or tearing of those neurons. And what you will see is this is one of the worst types of head injuries there is. DAI. You can see no physical damage. There's nothing to fix. But because of that stretching, a lot of these patients have severe head injuries, and they are in that GPS of severe head injury. Okay, so DAI, think of it as that stretching and pulling. It's like you take gum, pull it out of your mouth, and put it back. It doesn't always go back the same way. Lacerations typically are done with open head injuries. They can also be done with those skull fractures that have those bone shards. You often see lacerations with gunshot wounds. Okay? And if you look at MRIs or CTs with gunshot wounds, you can literally see the track where the bullet went. Now, if you have to have an open head injury and you're picking between your knife and your gun, the gun is less likely to cause infection because the bullet is so hot it causes a sterile tract. Okay? But it will still drive scalp and bone and stuff in the head. Okay? Like I was saying yesterday, it will also depend on the caliber of the bullet, whether it's jacketed or not, whether there will be an exit wound. Okay? 22s ricochet. 38s and 45s, however, tend to make an exit wound. And that exit wound is often larger than the entrance wound. So you can have damage to both sides of the brain. And this is what they were just talking about with that coup contra coup. Remember, if you have direct injury, you have direct under here, but you may have it on the opposite side because of that bounce. It's like a basketball bounce. And sometimes it can be worse. Depends on your mechanism of injury. Like often with motorcycle or motor vehicle crashes, that contra coup injury can be even worse. Now, concussion scales. If you've got kids that play soccer, advocate for the coach to put this in. This is a test that can be done at the beginning of the season, and then it can be done with any type of bump to the head to see if there's a difference. Basically, what they do is a 2-minute test that requires them to read single-digit numbers displayed on the card or on an iPad, and you time it. And then if they have a bump to the head, you have them to do the same test. If there's a difference between the time, after a concussion, it will increase. You sit them down. One of the things that we're finding is that they should not be allowed to play until they're seen by a licensed professional. You're fine, going back in. What we're finding is that a third of the kids that are being quote-unquote screened for concussion are sent back into the game without being thoroughly evaluated. But this is a good test. It doesn't have to be done by a medical professional. It can be done by your trainer. It can be done by a mom on the side. It can be done with someone that just has the training in order to be able to administer. Now, there are some biomarkers that we're starting to see, which is really sort of cool, because it used to be that there was no way you could tell. But there is a blood test now that detects glial fibrillary acid protein. Don't ask me what that is. But what you will see is it will detect mild to moderate traumatic brain lesions with up to 97% accuracy. So after you do this test on the sidelines, you might send them to the ER for this test and see. It remains in the bloodstream for up to 7 days following injury, which is important because a lot of times what you'll find is, you'll be all right tomorrow. You'll be all right tomorrow. No, doctor, don't put me out for a whole week, for a month. I'll miss the rest of the season. Well, it's better than being demented when you're old, like 23. A lot of times what you see is that people do delay treatment, and so it's nice that this protein stays like that. CTE is the result of traumatic impacts to the cranium, loss of memory, difficulty controlling impulsive or erratic behavior. We've seen several suicides linked to football players with CTE. Impaired judgment, aggression, depression, balance difficulties, and gradual onset of dementia. And that's at a younger age. Okay, CTE. Usually caused by multiple concussions. See it a lot in football players, soccer players, boxers. Though I will tell you that Muhammad Ali's CTE led to Parkinsonism instead of concussive disorder. All right, let's do epis and we'll call it a day. Epidural hematoma. Okay, epi means what? Above the dura. Okay, remember the dura adheres to the bone. Is there normally blood in that epidural space? No. So, what you see with epidural hematoma is arterial bleeding. And why is that important?
Because it's a pump of the heart.
It's not getting oxygen, but what else? It bleeds longer and faster. Okay? Arterial bleeding is quick. Venous bleeding is a slow ooze. Typically, epidural hematomas are caused by fractures of the temporal bone. There's usually their classic sign is the immediate loss of consciousness. They wake back up. They have a lucid period, whether you can't tell there's anything wrong with them, they rapidly deteriorate. And if this is not treated, they will die. So it's one of those things where everybody that loses consciousness should go to the emergency department, especially if they have temporal injury. You can think of a guy, this guy was a 9th degree black belt. He was in a tournament and he got a kick to the side of the head. Why he was not wearing his headgear, I don't know. Because he was big bad. But he developed a epidural hematoma. And after his surgery, he was confused with I'll get out. So if you can imagine trying to convince a 9th degree black belt that they need to stay in their chair or in their bed as they're confused, it was not fun. Because occasionally he got a little bit aggressive. So security had to be called several times. And of course, part 5 that came. So, epidural hematomas, arterial bleeding, that classic sign, loss of consciousness, lucid period where they come back around and seem fine, but then they rapidly deteriorate. Okay? He got okay. I mean, once his confusion cleared, he was fine. He apologized to everybody that he beat up. But it was not a fun 2 weeks, I can tell you. All right, so tomorrow we will start with subdurals, and then we will probably do strokes and print the rest of it out. Now, where I did not post 2 handouts, there's no notes on it, so it doesn't matter which one that you print. No, there's the notes for tomorrow and Friday. Now, one of the other things, let me tell you, listen up. In order to be able to take care of these patients, you need to know what parts of the brain do what. All right? That's anatomy and physiology. But to help you remember it, I posted a Quizlet that gives you flashcards and the ability to test yourself. The same thing with all of these wonderful words that I'm using, like anosmia, anomia, aphasia, dysphagia, conjugate. Those are words that will be likely seen on NCLEX. So you need to start beefing up your vocab. And I've also posted a vocab list in Quizlet that lets you check those. Okay? The words that are on that Quizlet, you are responsible